The last time I heard my son laugh, it was the sound of summer. It was rich and deep, bouncing off the old oak tree he'd climbed as a boy, and rattling the kitchen window where his wife, Clara, was arranging a bouquet of sunflowers. He'd just told a terrible joke, the kind only a father could love, and the sound of his joy was so pure, so absolute, it felt like it could hold the roof of this house up forever. That sound is gone now, replaced by a silence so heavy it cracks the floorboards and puts a chill in the air that no furnace can warm. I sit in the same chair I sat in that day, but the only sound is the frantic beat of my own heart, asking a question I can't answer. How can a home built on love become a tomb in less than a month? Before I dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories like this, please like and subscribe. It helps me keep sharing more. My son, Arthur, was the architect of my life's second act. After his mother passed, the world went gray, but Arthur brought the color back. He was a good man, steady and kind, with my late wife's gentle eyes and my calloused hands from a lifetime of working the land this house stands on. He met Clara in college, a whirlwind of bright, ambitious energy. When he brought her home here, to the place I built board by board, she seemed to fit right in. Her laughter joined his, filling halls that had grown too quiet. They married on the lawn under that oak, and for 5 years this house was a sanctuary. I thought it would be the place I'd watch my grandchildren grow, where I'd live out my days surrounded by the echoes of a family's happiness. I was wrong. The police called it a freak accident, a single car on a quiet road, a patch of black ice in early spring. One moment Arthur was driving home, the next he was gone. The silence he left behind was a physical thing, a weight that pressed down on my chest and made it hard to breathe. In those first few days, Clara and I were adrift in the same boat of grief. We'd sit in the living room, the space between us filled with unspoken words, her hands clutching a cold cup of tea, mine gripping the worn arms of my recliner until my knuckles ached. But then, a subtle shift began, a change in the atmosphere so slight, I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. It started with the little things. The way she'd close a door a little too quietly when I entered a room. The way her eyes, once filled with shared sadness, would become guarded, almost calculating when she thought I wasn't looking. Have you ever watched someone you thought you knew become a complete stranger right before your eyes? The warmth that had defined her was evaporating, replaced by a brittle chill. One afternoon I found her in Arthur's study, a room he'd always kept meticulously organized. She had boxes on the floor, sorting through his papers with a disturbing efficiency, her movements sharp and precise. There was no sentimentality, no gentle touch for the objects my son had held. It was like watching an auditor liquidate an asset. I stood in the doorway, my heart aching. "Clara," I said softly. "What are you doing, my dear?" She didn't look up, just slid a stack of files into a box labeled Finance. "Organizing," she said, her voice flat, devoid of the melody it once had. "Things need to be sorted before the lawyer calls." The sound of her voice, so clipped and businesslike while handling my dead son's life, sent a shiver down my spine. This was the first true sign, the first cold brick in the wall she was building. A few days before the accident, I'd overheard a fragment of a phone call Arthur was on. His back was to me, his shoulders tense as he stood by the kitchen window. His voice was low, strained. "No, that's not what we agreed," he'd said, an edge of desperation in his tone. "You can't just change the terms now. She doesn't know anything about it." He hung up abruptly when he saw me, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just a difficult client, Dad," he'd lied. At the time, I'd dismissed it. Now, watching Clara dismantle his life with such cold detachment, that snippet of conversation echoed in my mind. She doesn't know anything about it. Who was he talking about? What didn't Clara know? The call from the lawyer, a man named Mr. Finch, came a week later. I was in the kitchen when the phone rang. Clara snatched it from its cradle before the second ring, her movements like a predator lunging for its prey. I could only hear her side of the conversation. a series of clipped yeses and I understands. When she hung up, she turned to me, and for the first time, I saw something other than grief or coldness in her eyes. It was a flash of triumph, a glint of hunger so raw and unsettling it made the air go thin. "The will reading is tomorrow," she announced, her voice too loud in the silent house. "10 a.m., Mr. Finch's office." I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. "Okay, I'll be ready." She gave me a long, strange look that seemed to measure my worth and find it lacking. "Good," was all she said before walking away, leaving me alone with a growing dread that felt like a living thing coiling in my stomach. I spent the night in a restless sleep, dreaming of my son's laughter turning into the sound of shattering glass. The next morning, I put on the dark gray suit I'd worn to Arthur's funeral, straightening the tie he had given me for my 70th birthday. It felt like putting on armor for a battle I didn't understand. I walked downstairs to find Clara standing by the front door, her purse in her hand, her car keys jingling impatiently. She was dressed in a sleek black dress that looked more suited to a boardroom than a law office. She saw me on the stairs, and her face hardened into a mask of pure ice. Her eyes swept over my suit, a flicker of disgust in her gaze. "Where do you think you're going?" she asked, her voice laced with a venom I had never heard before. I paused on the bottom step, confused. "To the lawyer's office, for the reading. You said 10 o'clock. She let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound completely alien to the woman I knew. It was a sound of derision, of cruel amusement. "Oh, you poor old man," she said, shaking her head slowly. "You still don't get it, do you? Arthur is gone. This is my life now, my inheritance. You're not coming." The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. I gripped the banister to steady myself, my knuckles turning white. "Clara, what are you saying? I'm his father." She took a step toward me, her face contorted with a rage that seemed to come from some deep, hidden well of resentment. "You're nothing," she hissed, her voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "You're just a relic, a piece of old furniture in my house, and I'm about to redecorate." For a moment that stretched into eternity, her words hung in the air like poison gas, burning my lungs and clouding my vision. She claimed Arthur had felt trapped, that he'd confessed to her months before he died that my presence in the house was a burden, a constant reminder of a life he wanted to escape. She said he'd planned to move me into a state-run facility, that the only reason he hadn't was because he was a coward. "He owed me a life free of you," she said, her voice a low, chilling monotone. "And now I'm just collecting on that debt." Was this the truth my son had been hiding? Or was this monster standing before me simply twisting his memory into a weapon to destroy me? The shock was so profound it felt like my heart had stopped. All I could feel was the cold, smooth wood of the banister under my trembling hand. "That's a lie," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. "Arthur would never. He loved this house. He loved me." Clara's face twisted into a sneer of contempt. "Love? You old fool. He loved the idea of family, but the reality was suffocating him. You, with your stories and your memories and your constant puttering around, you were a ghost haunting him in his own home." She stepped forward, and I flinched back. "What would you have done if your own son's wife said that to you?" Her rage was a physical force, pushing me back up the stairs. "Pack a bag," she commanded. "I want you out. Now." I was frozen, my mind unable to process the sheer cruelty of it all. This was Clara, the girl who once brought me a blanket when I'd fallen asleep in my chair, the woman who cried on my shoulder when Arthur had to go away for a week on business. The transformation was so complete, it felt like a possession. "Clara, please," I begged, my voice cracking. "Don't do this. Let's just talk. We can figure something out." She laughed again, that same horrifying, joyless sound. "There's nothing to figure out. The will gives me everything. The house, the money, everything. Arthur made sure of it." She turned and stormed up the stairs past me, heading for my room. I followed on weak legs, my body moving on instinct alone. I watched in numb silence as she pulled my old canvas duffel bag from the closet, the one I used for fishing trips with Arthur. She didn't pack. She ravaged. She threw in a few shirts, a pair of trousers, my shaving kit. An old, framed photo of my late wife, Eleanor, fell from my bedside table, and the glass cracked with a sickening sound against the hardwood floor. Clara didn't even glance down. She just kicked the shattered frame aside with her foot. The touch of the cold floorboards through my socks was the only thing that felt real. My entire life, the 72 years I had lived within these walls in one form or another, was being stuffed into a bag by a woman filled with a hatred I couldn't comprehend. She zipped the bag with a vicious tug and shoved it into my chest, forcing me to stumble backward. "Get out," she said, her voice dangerously low. She marched me back down the stairs, her hand on my back, pushing me toward the front door I had so proudly installed 40 years ago. When my hand touched the cold brass of the doorknob, a final, desperate plea escaped me. "Where am I supposed to go?" I asked, my voice barely audible. She yanked the door open, letting in a blast of cold morning air that felt like a slap. She looked me up and down, her eyes filled with a disgust so pure it made me feel like something vile she'd found under a rock. She threw my bag out onto the porch, where it landed with a dull thud. Then she looked me dead in the eye, and her lips curled back from her teeth. "I don't care," she screamed, the sound echoing in the pristine foyer. "Go die in a dumpster." The force of the words was physical. They slammed into me, and for a second I thought I might fall. Then she slammed the door in my face. The sound was like a gunshot, a final deafening end to everything I had ever known. I heard the deadbolt click into place, a sharp metallic sound that sealed my fate. I stood there on the porch, trembling, the frigid air seeping into my bones, listening to the silence of the house that was no longer my home. My gaze fell on the tattered bag at my feet. Sticking out from a side pocket was something that didn't belong to me, something she must have knocked in by accident. It was a folded, yellowed piece of paper, and I could just make out Arthur's familiar, hurried handwriting on the visible edge. Arthur learned to ride his first bicycle on this very porch. He was 5, all scraped knees and fierce determination, his little hands gripping the handlebars so tight his knuckles were white. I remember the smell of the freshly cut grass and the dusty, sweet scent of the climbing roses Eleanor had planted. He wobbled, he fell, and he cried. But then he looked at me, his eyes full of a trust so absolute it was humbling, and said, "Again, Grandpa." We stayed out until the sun bled into the horizon, and the sound of his triumphant bell ringing as he finally pedaled on his own is a memory so sharp, so perfect, it feels like I could reach out and touch it. But the laughter was gone. The roses had long since withered, and the only thing I could feel now was the biting wind on my face and the unbearable weight of the silence from behind the door. I stood there for what felt like an hour, my feet rooted to the spot, a ghost on my own doorstep. The world outside the manicured lawn of my former life seemed to move in a blurry, surreal haze. Cars drove by, a neighbor waved, and I could only manage a weak, pathetic lift of my hand in return. The sight of my own home, every window and shingle a part of my soul, now looked alien and forbidding. It was a fortress, and I was the enemy banished from its walls. Shame, hot and prickly, crawled up my neck. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let anyone see me like this, a discarded old man with a duffel bag and a shattered heart. Do you think I was a fool to trust her for so long? To live beside that woman and see nothing of the viper coiled inside? I picked up the bag, the canvas rough and unfamiliar in my grip, and started walking. I didn't have a destination. I just put one foot in front of the other, each step taking me further from the only life I had ever known. The pavement felt hard and unforgiving under my thin dress shoes. I ended up at a small, run-down motel on the edge of town, the kind with a flickering neon sign that hummed a sad, electric tune. I paid for a room with the cash I had in my wallet, the young woman behind the counter barely looking up from her phone. The room was small and smelled of stale cigarette smoke and bleach. The bedspread was a faded, scratchy brown, and the single window looked out onto a brick wall. It was the loneliest place I had ever been. I dropped the bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress, the springs groaning in protest. The silence in this room was different from the silence at the house. It wasn't heavy with memory. It was empty, a hollow void that echoed my own despair. My hand went to the side pocket of the bag, my fingers closing around the brittle edges of that folded paper. With trembling hands, I pulled it out. It was a single sheet of yellow legal paper, folded into a small, tight square. It was creased and worn, as if it had been folded and unfolded many times. As I opened it, the faint scent of cedar and my son's pipe tobacco reached me, a ghostly reminder that brought a fresh wave of grief. His handwriting was messy, rushed, the words scrawled across the page with an urgent pressure. It wasn't a will or a legal document, it was a letter. To me. "Dad," it began, "if you are reading this, then I've made a terrible mistake. I've trusted the wrong person, and I'm afraid. I'm so sorry. I didn't know how to tell you. I've been trying to fix it, trying to protect you, but I think she knows. Clara isn't the woman we thought she was. There's a darkness in her, a greed I never saw until it was too late. The money changed everything. She's been moving things, hiding assets, and I think she's been lying to me from the start. I've set something aside, a failsafe, for you, and for what's right. I put it all in a safety deposit box at Sterling Bank downtown. The key is hidden. Remember the stone sentinel we built by the old shed when I was a boy? The one you said would watch over our garden? It's under his watchful eye. Take the key to Elias Vance. He's my old college friend, the only lawyer I trust now. Don't trust Finch. Finch works for her. Elias knows what to do. He has the other key and all the documentation. Please, Dad, don't let her win. This house, everything Mom and you built, it was never meant for her. Be careful. I love you. Arthur." I read the letter 3 times, my eyes tracing the familiar loops and slants of my son's hand. The words were a lifeline thrown into the abyss of my despair. He hadn't abandoned me. He hadn't thought I was a burden. He had been trying to protect me. The story Clara had woven of a resentful, trapped son was a venomous lie, a fantasy she had constructed to justify her own monstrous greed. A new feeling began to burn through the cold fog of my grief, rage, a pure, clean anger that sharpened my senses and cleared my mind. She hadn't just stolen my home, she had desecrated my son's memory. She had used his death as a tool to inflict the deepest possible pain. And my son, my dear Arthur, had seen it coming. He had fought back in the only way he could, leaving me a secret map to justice. The stone sentinel, a small, lopsided gargoyle I had helped him carve from a block of granite one summer. It sat on a post next to the dilapidated garden shed, a forgotten relic of his childhood. Clara would never have given it a second glance. It was perfect. I was not a helpless old man waiting to die in a dumpster. I was a father with a final promise to keep. My purpose was now crystal clear, as sharp and cold as a shard of broken glass. I had to get that key. I stood up and walked to the grimy window, looking out at the brick wall as if I could see through it all the way back to my home. The sun was setting, casting long, dark shadows across the city. She thought she had won. She thought she had thrown me away like garbage. But she had no idea that I was coming back. That night, under the cover of darkness, I was going to sneak back onto my own property like a thief to reclaim the one thing that could destroy her. The moon was a cold silver coin in the black sky, casting long skeletal shadows across the lawn I had mowed for 40 years. Lying on my stomach in the damp ditch across the road, the smell of wet earth and decay filling my nostrils, I watched my own house as if it were an enemy compound. Every window was dark except for one upstairs, the master bedroom. A faint, blue-white light flickered from within, the unmistakable glow of a television. She was in there, comfortable in the bed I had once shared with my wife, oblivious. The sight of it, that casual occupation of my most sacred spaces, stoked the fire of my anger until it was a clean, white-hot flame. It burned away the fear, leaving only purpose. I waited until a passing cloud smothered the moon, plunging the world into near-total darkness. This was my chance. I scrambled out of the ditch, my old joints protesting, and moved across the road in a low crouch. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the night's silence. Have you ever felt like a stranger in a place that should feel like home? Every familiar shape becomes a monster, every shadow a threat. The rose bushes Eleanor had planted looked like grasping claws, and the mighty oak tree, the one that held so many of Arthur's childhood memories, seemed to groan a warning in the wind. I didn't dare use the driveway. The crunch of the gravel would be a death sentence. Instead, I slipped along the side of the house, keeping close to the cool, rough texture of the stone siding I had laid myself. My hand brushed against it, and for a second, I felt the ghost of a connection, a memory of a younger man full of hope, building a future. I pushed the thought away. Sentimentality was a luxury I could not afford. The back of the house was darker, shielded from the streetlights. The old garden shed stood at the edge of the property, a sagging, stooped silhouette against the slightly less black sky, and next to it, on its rotting wooden post, was the stone sentinel. It was smaller than I remembered, a lopsided gargoyle with a goofy, chipped grin, weathered by years of sun and snow. It was a silly, childish thing, and in that moment it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I knelt before it, my knees sinking into the soft, damp soil of the garden. My hands, clumsy with cold and adrenaline, fumbled at the base of the post. Arthur's instructions echoed in my mind. It's under his watchful eye. The earth was cold and packed tight. I dug with my bare fingers, the grit working its way under my nails, the sharp edge of a buried stone slicing my skin. I didn't feel the pain. I just dug, my breath coming in ragged, silent gasps, my eyes constantly darting back to the single lighted window. Any second, I expected the back porch light to flood the yard, to hear her voice screaming, to face the humiliation of being caught like a common thief. But nothing happened. The television flickered on, a silent blue messenger of my enemy's distraction. Then my fingers hit something hard and cold. It wasn't a rock. It was metal. Carefully, I worked it free from the dirt. It was a small, heavy object wrapped in oilcloth. My hands shook so violently I could barely untie the string binding it. Inside the cloth was a single, ornate brass key. It wasn't a house key. It was the key to a safety deposit box. A wave of relief so powerful it almost brought me to my knees washed over me. I had it. I had the first piece of my son's legacy, the first weapon in a war I was now ready to fight. I clutched it in my fist, the sharp edges of the key digging into my palm, a small, grounding pain. I had the proof. Arthur hadn't abandoned me. He had armed me. I was about to stand up to slip back into the shadows and disappear into the night, when the world froze. The sound of an engine, smooth and expensive, cut through the quiet. Headlights swept across the front of the house, their beams slicing through the darkness of the backyard, catching me in their momentary glare. I dropped to the ground, pressing myself flat against the earth, my face buried in the dirt and wet leaves. My heart stopped. A car door opened, then closed with a solid, heavy thud. It wasn't the sound of Clara's little sports car. This was something bigger. Footsteps crunched on the gravel driveway. A man's voice called out her name, low and confident. "Clara, it's me. Open up." A moment later, the porch light flickered on, illuminating the yard in a harsh yellow glare. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying the shadows of the shed would hide me. I heard the front door open, followed by the murmur of voices. I risked a glance. Silhouetted in the bright rectangle of the open doorway stood a tall, well-dressed man, and as he turned, his face was illuminated by the light from inside. It wasn't a stranger. It was Mr. Finch, the lawyer, her lawyer. And he wasn't carrying a briefcase. He was carrying a shovel. The sight of Finch, my son's supposed counselor, standing on my porch with a shovel in his hand and a look of grim purpose on his face, sent a jolt of ice water through my veins. This wasn't a late-night legal consultation. This was something else entirely, something sordid and conspiratorial. The key in my fist suddenly felt heavier, colder, a talisman against a darkness I was only just beginning to comprehend. From my hiding place, the sound of their voices drifted across the lawn, distorted by the night air but clear enough to piece together. "Did you bring it?" Clara asked, her voice a sharp, impatient whisper. Finch nodded, stepping inside. He leaned the shovel against the wall just inside the door. "It's done," he said. "The new documents are filed. As of this morning, you have full, uncontested control. The transfer of the $55 million is already in process, but we have a loose end to tie up." He lowered his voice, but his next words were carried on the wind, sharp as daggers. Arthur was getting paranoid. He mentioned a fail-safe in his last email. Something for the old man. We need to find it before he does. My breath caught in my throat. They knew. Or at least, they suspected. My son's desperate final act of love was not a secret. It was a problem they were actively trying to solve. Clara's laugh was a brittle, ugly thing. "The old man? He's gone. I threw him out this morning. He's probably curled up in a gutter somewhere, crying into a bottle. He's not a threat." Finch's tone was less confident, more cautious. "Don't underestimate him, Clara. Arthur respected him. If there's something hidden, the old man is the only one who'd know where to look. Arthur talked about this place, about his childhood, about some stupid things they built together. We need to check the grounds. Now." The front door closed, plunging the yard back into semi-darkness. My mind raced. They were going to search. The freshly disturbed earth at the base of the Sentinel would be a beacon in the dark. I had to move, and I had to move now. But where could I go? If I made a run for the street, the sound of my footsteps on the gravel would surely give me away. I was trapped. I heard the back door slide open. A beam of a powerful flashlight cut a brilliant white path across the lawn, sweeping back and forth like a prison searchlight. I pressed myself flatter against the ground, the dampness seeping through my clothes, chilling me to the bone. The beam danced over the shed, passed over my hiding spot by mere inches, and then settled on the stone sentinel. "There," Finch's voice said, closer now. He mentioned a stone gargoyle or something. "Let's start there." I could hear their footsteps on the grass getting closer and closer. My heart was a wild bird trapped in my ribs, beating itself raw. The key in my palm felt like it was burning my skin. This was it. They were going to find the hole. They were going to know I had been there. And then what? Do you think I was right to be afraid? What would you fear more, being caught, or failing the person you're trying to save? In that moment of pure animal panic, an image of Arthur as a boy flashed through my mind. He was 7 years old and we were working on the shed. He had dropped my hammer into the old, dry well behind it, a relic from the original farmhouse that had stood on this land a century ago. It was only about 15 feet deep, but too narrow for a grown man to climb down. Arthur, small and wiry, had insisted on going down himself, lowered on a rope to retrieve it. I remembered the musty, earthy smell of that well, the way it swallowed the light. The well. It was still there, covered by a heavy, rotting wooden lid just behind the shed. It was my only chance. As their flashlight beam moved away for a second, sweeping toward the other side of the yard, I moved. I didn't run. I crawled. I stayed as low as I could, my body screaming in protest, and scuttled backward into the deeper shadows behind the shed. My hand fumbled in the dark, searching for the edge of the well cover. My fingers brushed against the splintered, moss-covered wood. I pulled. It was heavy, swollen with years of rain. It scraped against the stone lip of the well with a groan that sounded deafeningly loud in the silence. I froze, listening. "Did you hear that?" Clara's voice. "Probably just a raccoon," Finch dismissed. "Keep looking." I pulled again, with every ounce of strength I had. The lid moved just enough for me to slip through the opening. I dangled my legs into the blackness, my feet finding nothing but empty air. The smell of damp earth and cold stone rushed up to meet me. Taking a final shaky breath, I let go of the edge and dropped into the darkness, pulling the heavy lid back into place over my head. I landed with a jarring thud on the soft, loamy bottom, the impact sending a shockwave up my spine. Above me, the sliver of moonlight I had seen through the gap was gone. I was plunged into absolute suffocating blackness. My ears were ringing. I could hear the thumping of my own blood. And then, I heard their footsteps directly above me, the heavy tread of Finch's dress shoes and the lighter, quicker steps of Clara. I could hear their voices, muffled but terrifyingly close. "Nothing here," Finch grumbled. "The ground hasn't been disturbed." I had covered my tracks just enough. "I told you," Clara said, her voice dripping with annoyance. "He's gone. This is a waste of time. The money is what matters. Let's go back inside and celebrate." Their footsteps receded. I heard the back door slide shut, and then once again there was silence. I was alone, trapped in a cold, dark hole in the ground, with the key to my son's justice clutched in my hand, and the chilling realization that my daughter-in-law and her lawyer were not just greedy, they were hunting for something and they were willing to do anything to find it. The key was no longer just a path to the truth, it was a target on my back. I had escaped them for now, but as I sat in the silent black earth, I knew this was just the beginning. I had to get to Elias Vance. But how could I escape my own backyard, which had now become enemy territory patrolled by monsters? The darkness in the well was absolute. A thick, velvety blackness that swallowed sound and sight. The air was cold and stale, heavy with the smell of damp earth and a century of forgotten time. For a long while, I just sat there, my back pressed against the curved, cold stone, letting the adrenaline seep out of me, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. Above, I imagined them, Clara and Finch, toasting their victory with my son's expensive whiskey in the house I built. They were celebrating a heist, not mourning a husband. The thought reignited the embers of my rage. I wasn't going to let them win. I wasn't going to let Arthur's last stand be for nothing. Elias Vance, Sterling Bank. The name and the place were a mantra, a prayer in the dark. I ran my thumb over the sharp edges of the key in my pocket, its metallic reality a comfort in the suffocating black. After what felt like hours, a faint gray light began to filter through the cracks in the wooden lid above me. Dawn. It was time to move. Pushing against the damp earth, I got to my feet, my muscles screaming in protest. Placing my hands flat against the underside of the lid, I pushed upwards. It was heavier now, settled back into its groove. For a terrifying moment, it wouldn't budge. Panic flared in my chest. What if I was trapped? What if this hole became my tomb? I took a deep breath, braced my legs, and shoved with every ounce of strength I had left. The lid scraped open with a low groan, and a slice of pale, pre-dawn light cut through the darkness. I squinted, my eyes aching from the sudden brightness. Peeking through the gap, I saw that the backyard was empty. The lights in the house were off. They were asleep. This was my only chance. I scrambled out of the well, a creature crawling from the earth, covered in dirt and grime, and slipped back into the shadows of the tree line. I didn't look back. Looking back was a weakness I couldn't afford. I walked the 5 miles to the nearest bus station, an old man caked in mud, invisible to the early morning commuters who averted their eyes. Sterling Bank was a fortress of marble and glass downtown, a temple dedicated to the kind of wealth Clara now possessed. Elias Vance's office was on the top floor. He was a young man, but his eyes held an old soul's gravity. They were Arthur's eyes, I realized, kind, steady, and sharp. He listened without interruption as my story tumbled out, a messy, frantic confession of grief, betrayal, and a midnight escape. I placed the grimy, oilcloth-wrapped key on his polished mahogany desk. His face was a mask of calm professionalism, but I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, anger. "I was worried this would happen," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Arthur called me a week before he died. He was afraid of her. He said he had made a terrible mistake, that he'd signed documents under duress, believing they were for something else entirely. He picked up the key. He told me that if anything happened to him, you would come. He set up this trust, this secret clause, as an emergency brake, a way to stop her if she showed her true colors. The day of the final hearing felt like a dream. Clara was there, of course, dressed in a sharp, ridiculously expensive suit, looking every bit the grieving widow who had inherited a fortune. Finch was by her side, smug and reptilian. When I walked in, wearing the same gray suit from the day she'd thrown me out, her face contorted in a brief, ugly flash of shock and fury, before smoothing back into a mask of polite indifference. Mr. Finch began, his voice oozing false sympathy, outlining the terms of Arthur's will. Clara was the sole beneficiary. The house, the stocks, the entire $55 million estate was hers. He finished, and the judge, a stern-looking woman with tired eyes, looked over at Clara. "Congratulations, Mrs. Thorne," she said, her voice flat. Clara gave a small demure nod, a perfect performance of humbled gratitude. Finch patted her hand. It was over. They had won. Then Elias Vance stood up. "Your Honor," he said, his voice ringing with clarity in the quiet courtroom, "we are not contesting the will. We are here to enforce it, specifically, Clause 12B. Finch scoffed. "There is no Clause 12B. "There is," Elias said, sliding a document across the table. It was part of a notarized addendum to the marital trust signed by Arthur Thorne a month before his death. An addendum Mr. Finch seems to have conveniently lost. Luckily, we have a copy. The judge's eyes narrowed. "Read it, Mr. Vance." Elias cleared his throat. Clause 12B, the character proviso, states that the full inheritance is conditional. It is contingent upon the beneficiary, Clara Thorne, providing continuous, demonstrable, and compassionate care for the testator's father, William Thorne, within the family home for a period of no less than 10 years. Should she fail to meet this condition, should she in any way evict, neglect, or cause him harm, the will is rendered null and void. The courtroom was utterly silent. Finch's face went pale, a sickly greenish white. Clara just stared, her perfectly made-up face frozen in disbelief. "Furthermore," Elias continued, his voice like the tolling of a bell, "in the event of the clause being broken, the entirety of the estate, every dollar, every stock, and the deed to the house, is to be immediately transferred to a charitable trust established in his mother's name, Eleanor Thorne's Foundation for the Arts, the sole administrator of which," Elias paused, letting the words hang in the air, "is William Thorne." The lawyer, Mr. Finch, suddenly let out a strangled noise, a sound caught between a gasp and a laugh. "Did you hear the will correctly?" he sputtered, looking at Clara with wide, panicked eyes. "Did he say all of it?" But Clara wasn't listening. The blood had drained from her face. Her eyes were locked on me, wide with a horror that was beautiful to behold. She saw it all slipping away, the money, the power, the house, everything. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her body swayed, her eyes rolled back in her head, and she collapsed to the floor in a dead faint. The last thing I saw before the bailiffs rushed in was Finch, staring down at her crumpled form, not with concern, but with the cold, calculating panic of a rat on a sinking ship. He knew he was next. My son had not left me a weapon to fight her. He had left her a cage she had willingly walked into and then slammed the door on herself. He had used her own greed as the instrument of her downfall, and now I held the key. The greatest deceptions are not the lies we are told, but the ones we tell ourselves. Clara convinced herself she was entitled to a fortune, but she was blind to the price it would cost her soul. True inheritance is not what is left to you, but what is left in you. My son left me his trust, and that is a treasure no amount of money can buy. What do you think Clara's first words will be when she wakes up? Tell me in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing for more tales of justice served.